Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. You are listening to the sultry voice of one Evan Buck. Hey, everyone, how's it going? It's your boy, Evan. Joining me tonight in another edition of the two-seater A-Fit Mobile is my good friend, Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people.
All right, now that it is in fact an episode, let me just briefly recap with where we are taking us today. We're going to be doing a part 2 on the alternate timeline of what if Lumumba, who was the leader of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Patrice Lumumba, what if he had not been assassinated in early 1960? Or 1961 rather, but he instead was able to escape and lead a contingent to rule over a part of what is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. For purpose of our podcast and just to keep things simple, we are going to be referring to this area again broadly as the Congo, even though there are two countries that are named similarly in our modern parlance when you look on the atlas. And so in the last episode, we talked about how there would essentially be a three-way split of the territory that would be the modern Congo territory. And Katanga, in this alternate timeline, actually successfully secedes and becomes its own independent nation. And we started cooking up some interesting things with regards to how the Cold War might go differently in this region. And Chris, I think I would like to hand it over to you to just continue the recap and kind of start setting us on the path towards all roads lead to Luanda, I guess, in this episode.
Oh boy. So Evan and I kind of talked about where this is going even before the last episode, and he very much admitted, I'm just going to throw up my hands because I cannot read the article about this and make it make sense.
Yeah, it is quite dense for sure.
So I'm going to take a step, and hopefully everything I'm about to say is like our timeline. I have to stress that because, like, at least me as an American, Evan, sound off on this. I don't feel like, even though what I'm talking about here was like within the adulthood of my father, of my parents, it is not known about.
It's one of those things that I don't think is extremely well known about. I mean, if you look at some of the depressing statistics on how many Americans cannot accurately locate Iran on a map, like 23%, I believe, of American voters can locate Iran. Certainly, I would imagine the number is even lower than that with regards to trying to locate Angola or Congo on a map as well.
And those are the countries that survive what we're doing.
Right.
Katanga, God help us.
Yeah.
So
is that like a margarita style drink or something? That's what I bet a lot of people would think that means.
So
the Katanga special, maybe that can be like episode art or something.
No.
I don't know.
I don't know, but no. So, okay. I promise I'm going to try and make this chronologically make sense. Early mid 1960s, when Belgium decides to get out of the Congo, Great Britain decides it is also going to stop, give all of its colonies independence. We talked a little bit last episode about Nkrumah over in Ghana being the first person to do that. And basically, Britain sets forth a policy saying, okay, a little bit like what Belgium did in the Congo, we're going to organize an election based upon universal suffrage, and the people that win that election will form the government of independence. That is how Lumumba became prime minister of the Congo. So the British set forward this policy, and in one of their colonies, a group of white settlers say that is completely unacceptable to us. We want to stay in power. And that group was in what at that point was the colony of South Rhodesia. They issued something called the UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, as Rhodesia because North Rhodesia changed its name to Zambia. So they said, well, if there's no North Rhodesia, we shouldn't be South. We should just be Rhodesia. By the way, I don't know how many linguists we have. Rhodesia is not a indigenous term to Africa. It's a country named after Cecil Rhodes.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of sets up like what we're talking about here, but group of white settlers decided that basically, if you can believe it, that the British Empire was too woke for them. And did not participate, said we will not do the the established procedure for getting independence. Nope, we're just independent on our own. I promise I'm going to make all of these moving pieces come back together. This was in 1965. They declared their own independence. Great Britain and the rest of the Commonwealth, the rest of the world, refused to recognize the existence of the Rhodesian government. And just to kind of jump around a little bit, but to kind of explain where this leads, almost immediately there is an insurrection by the native Black African population against this government. And in 1980, they're overthrown. The leader of ZANU, which is the rebel group, takes over, Robert Mugabe, who was in power 2010s, I think. I think that's when he died.
I think so. And he was actually in our timeline. He was ousted in a coup by one of his supporters. I think that was in like the late 2010s.
Right. It was very late. He was in charge for a long time.
Yeah, from 1980 to like 2016, 2017, I think.
Right. And when he was ousted, he was like north of 80. It was one of those situations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Not saying that he could have still become a senator from Kentucky. However, so that's kind of Rhodesia. We're going to come back to that. The other part of this episode that did give Evan a headache was Angola. And I think that's kind of going to be a central focus of this episode for us. So, okay. For those of you playing along at home, we've talked about the Belgian Empire. We've talked about the British Empire. We haven't talked, well, the French Empire was the other Congo. So they're out of the picture. If I were to tell you there's a European colonial power we've missed, it's the Portuguese somehow.
Somehow. Like they have Angola, they have Mozambique. I think we did have a passing shout out reference to Germany last episode. I want to say with Tanganyika, which is now Tanzania. But yeah, we haven't mentioned the Portuguese, who are in the mix as well. Still,
The one thing I love about I kind of enjoy is like and I think I want to say it's Joe Kasabian really points out like, hey guys, the British Empire gets a name, the French Empire gets a name. That's because they just did it in more countries. The Portuguese were pretty brutal. And I think it's interesting to think about like the Portuguese actually got the colonies of Angola, Sao Tome, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique in like their heyday. So picture like 1500s. Before the discovery of the Americas is kind of when they're starting their empires. They're in charge until 1975. They're like basically the last. They were the first empire in Africa. They're the last empire in Africa. And basically what happens in our timeline is in 1975, the Estado Novo, I feel like I said that like it was Spanish because I don't know what it's
yeah, I
supposed
was
to
gonna
be.
say that sounded a little like something I'd hear around here in San Diego.
Um, gets overthrown. It's the that regime is like a 1930s semi-fascist Salazar regime. Is friendly with Franco when he's in power. So like there's a lot of history there. There's a revolution that I don't want to call them fascist, but authoritarian military government gets overthrown, and they decide we're going to get out of the colony business. In a basically in a move that is similar to what the Belgians did, the Portuguese say, we're gone. We're just leaving. And it's it's interesting that Evan, you use the all roads lead to Luanda reference
Uh-huh.
because that's kind of what happened, which is like when the Portuguese military leaves, there's a rush of three different rebel groups. They all mount up on whatever they have and run for the capital of Luanda because they want to be in the capital when independence is declared because they want their flag being the one raised. And they think if we're in the capital, when independence happens, we'll be the government. Um, okay. Here's where I get to the alphabet soup.
Here we go. And this is where we start giving the United Nations a run for its money with alphabet soup and acronyms and all that.
The other thing that needs to be said is, again, all of these are Portuguese, so it's not going to line up. However, the people that win the race, I guess, to Luanda, and kind of the party that to some extent is still like in charge of Angola today is the MPLA, which is the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. Again, it doesn't make sense. Deal with it. They are explicitly pro-Soviet, and they wind up getting a lot of help from actually Cuba. We'll get into that. One of the other groups is the FNLA, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola. Somehow, that is kind of a Maoist guerrilla group that, remember, 1975, this is after 1973, so the Chinese are good again. Um, and somehow the Chinese Maoist and not quite Nixon, I think he's resigned by now, but straight up Henry Kissinger are both supporting the FNLA trying to beat um, the MPLA to Luanda, and then in the ensuing civil war. You have
I
none
mean,
of
they may be Maoist, they may be communist, but they're at least a different flavor of communism that's not the wrong flavor of communism that we don't like.
and you shouldn't like the best way to keep your sanity and understand um the Angolan Civil War is do not think about ideology because
Yeah.
everybody is communist.
Pretty much, yeah. It's just
Everybody is some form of communist.
what strain are we going to go for?
The third group is UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. The best way to wrap your mind around who and what UNITA is it is basically Joseph Savimbi's kind of like personality cult. He's a very charismatic guerrilla leader. And he is basically leading another of these groups. I have to point this out. For those of you that have played Black Ops 2, Call of Duty, you fought for Savimbi. He's in there. Trying to give people a frame of reference about this. Okay, MPLA wins the race into Luanda, but the US, China, in this point, again, I am still talking about what actually happened because I'm trying to give the background here so people can get it. Zaire, which let's rewind a second, is the new name for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That is what Mobutu changes the name of the Congo to. So Mobutu's involved in this. Hey, spoiler alert, people. Whoever is in charge of whatever polity is in the Congo is going to get involved in this.
100%.
Mobutu is supporting UNITA. The United States is supporting UNITA and the FNLA, as is Communist China. And then South Africa enters the chat because, of course, they do.
Why not?
South Africa, hey, getting back to the German colonies, has a protectorship of a former German colony, what is today Namibia, just on the southern border of Angola. And they start intervening in the civil war in Angola. We're not even talking about support. We're not talking about shipments of arms. We're not talking about training. The South African army invades Angola to try and displace the MPLA. Soviet Union and Cuba send troops to Angola to fight against the South African army plus whatever rump guerrilla groups they're still backing in the country. And it kind of drags. Eventually, South Africa winds up leaving. The MPLA kind of forms a government that now has some political representation from other groups, but also those other groups, UNITA especially, for a while went what's called kind of went illegal. They went terrorist bombing, still violent resistance. FNLA went the route of political deal making and has seats in the parliament today. So that kind of, but it's still the MPLA that runs the country for the past. What are we at? What
I
are
mean,
we at?
it's basically been since independence, as far
Yeah,
as I'm aware, since
50 years.
1970. Yeah, 1975.
Okay. I think that kind of gets us up to a good point.
Mhm.
also, you know, when I say South Africa, we are still talking about the apartheid regime there that
Correct.
ends in the early 90s, but I don't think we don't need to get too much into that because that's kind of a little more well known.
Right. Exactly. And we're not going to get too far into those weeds there, even though they are definitely involved here. I think most of the focus is still going to remain on Lumumba and Katanga and all of those kind of countries, other countries in the neighborhood, because we already know kind of how South Africa, the apartheid regime responds in our timeline, and it's probably going to be fairly similar to what happens in the alternate timeline. But what I think, and by the way, thank you very, very much, Chris, for your ability to synthesize and condense the information that gave me a headache when I was trying to do it myself. Your contributions and service are greatly appreciated, and I'm sure our audience is very grateful as well. Um, but at risk of being a little bit too reductionist, I do think that something that I noted in the pre-podcast and on my brief notes I wrote for this part is I think there's a strong possibility and likelihood that with Lumumba, the Pan-Africanist that he is, the more Soviet-aligned, Soviet-backed leader that he would very much, I think, be in favor of backing the winning, which ends up becoming the winning horse in Angola, the MPLA. And to me, I don't have any reason to think that that would not rather significantly, curtail the length of the Angolan Civil War. Like if we have arms, if we have, even troops possibly being committed from that part of the Congo, then I think that just gives them a little bit more of an ability to consolidate control even faster. But what do you think about that assertion?
Um, if Lumumba's regime was in charge of all of the Congo, I would agree with you to the extent that I would even say that he probably is hosting the MPLA even before Portugal starts talking about independence, and might even be creating, because it is just over the border, creating an issue for Portugal that didn't exist in our timeline, pushing them more towards decolonization or putting more of a stress on
I
the
could definitely see that.
authoritarian regime.
But I think you did have an important note in that sentence, and that's if he had full control. He
Which,
doesn't have full control in this alternate timeline. And we do
right.
have Katanga to deal with as well.
And I think thinking about what the leadership, what Katanga looked like in the Congo crisis of 1960, there's a reason I brought Rhodesia into this.
Yep.
Because I
just
think
random.
nothing is no. Because I think that is going to be a little bit that's going to look a lot like what Katanga is. Katanga in our timeline was kind of a refuge for the Belgian leadership, the Belgian technical class that had been in the Congo. That's where a lot of them fled. I think if you look at like the composition of Katanga and its military forces, a lot of their people were just straight up like white mercenaries that they hired. And I think that polity is going to look a little bit like Rhodesia and is going to be behaving like Rhodesia, except feel like the one difference is they are not going to be viewed as much as a rogue state.
Yeah.
I think if you look at the initial Congo crisis, the United Nations tried to stay neutral because they didn't want to actively take sides against the new breakaway state of Katanga. So, like, that has a different level of support than Rhodesia, who legitimately, like, again, the British Empire was too woke for them. That tells you what you need to know about how Rhodesia was viewed. They had no international recognition. They had huge problems with international trade and development, which, by the way, eventually even starts, is what winds up really pushing South Africa to do the same thing in apartheid there. So I think you got a white ruled state in the heart of Africa that the advantage is it has a lot of mineral wealth that
Yeah,
everybody wants.
exactly.
You can get away with a lot when you have that kind of wealth.
Exactly. And something that I mentioned in the pre-podcast because for those astute listeners among us who kind of know what ended up happening in Rhodesia, which ended up becoming Zimbabwe, just in keeping in mind like the demographics of, let's say, apartheid South Africa versus Rhodesia at this time. Rhodesia only had like 6%, 6.5% of, British/white Europeans, 93%, native Black population. There was, a few more, I would say, just a few more, your ruling European class in South Africa. But also Rhodesia/Zimbabwe doesn't so much have a lot of this mineral wealth that Katanga has. They're mostly known as being kind of like a breadbasket of Africa, or at least they used to be. Much more of an agricultural powerhouse at this point. And so, with the situation in Rhodesia of the white ruling class declaring their independence unilaterally, not receiving international backing, that was a big impetus for, a local native Black uprising revolution led by Robert Mugabe, who, again, keeping in line with Angola being led by the same political party for 50 years, Zimbabwe was led by the same man from 1980 to 2017. And of course, the same ruling party this entire time as well. So again, that just kind of goes to show the degree of political inertia that is, very endemic to this region of the world. Katanga is going to be a bit of a different situation, I think, because of the mineral wealth. But in terms of the governmental structure, I think, Chris, you had a pretty strong case that there would be a somewhat similar situation to what eventually played out in Rhodesia/Zimbabwe.
Only insofar as what the government looked like before
Yes.
Mugabe took over.
Yeah, before Mugabe, because from this point forward, there's going to be a split, even in the alternate timeline of what happens. But I digress.
So I think that's important to think about Katanga because one, Katanga probably is more stable. It isn't fighting an internal rebellion. And the other thing, that means they get to mess with their neighbors. I think what you're going to wind up seeing is in the late 70s, when the MPLA is fighting South Africa along its southern front, it's going to be getting very well funded and very well supplied rebels on the northern area coming out of Katanga, specifically because I think for two reasons. One, Katanga is going to be Western focused. That's where they sell a lot of those minerals. Might be interesting. We touched on it last episode about even today, kind of China's Belt and Road Initiative. China isn't as mineral hungry as it is in our timeline yet. So it's still going to be Western focused. The other thing is, I think they're going to love the idea of painting Angola as a failed state. A lot of what you'll hear, and by the way, there was massive inflation in our times Zimbabwe.
Oh, yeah. They went through, I think, 4 different iterations of their currency. You could look up like $1 trillion bills that were
Mhm.
printed. Like things got wild economically there.
At the
It
same
even
time,
puts Argentina,
oh yeah,
inflation to shame. Like it's honestly pretty crazy.
at the same time, there is an element today of people like looking back at how good Rhodesia was from a really racist perspective.
Very paternalistic, racist point of view.
And they look at what happened to the economy, to the country under Mugabe, and they say, well, this has nothing to do with the fact that the man was an 80-year-old kleptocrat personally running the country. No, it has to do with the fact that you kicked us out.
Yeah.
So when you kicked us out, oh well. Um, that's kind of like me saying, like, gee, Germany, once you kicked my family out in the 1930s, that's what started the problem. That's when it went bad.
Exactly. It
Yeah, there were
certainly
other.
wasn't. It had nothing to do with a certain Austrian painter and his
Well,
family not having emigrated to America, which was in another A Fork in Time episode. But
but so I think there's something to be said for the Katangan government wanting Angola to just descend into what racist Westerners think Africa naturally is, which is a bunch of people running around massacring each other.
yeah,
And
just tribal conflict up the wazoo.
they're gonna have the resources to kind of make that happen.
Yeah.
So
And not only do I think they have the resources to make that happen, but you got to remember Angola is one of the biggest oil exporting countries in this region of Africa. And so I definitely do not think that Katanga would mind at all having a certain slice of that to help them out.
the twofold problem with that. The areas that have the oil and gas are on the coast.
They're on the coastline.
So
Yeah.
that's the hardest part for Katanga to get to.
Yeah.
But disrupting it would be, not so much capturing the resource, but making sure those resources. Hey, today, look at Cuba. You think they like some access to cheap oil and gas?
You think they'd like that?
I mean, even we are talking the late 70s after the second oil shock. So if Angola could actually get its act together, and by the way, this is something that feeds forward into the 90s. Like
Yep.
I mentioned, that the UNITA goes rebel. One of the things they kept doing was attacking and taking over oil facilities, and that created a huge problem for the. I don't want to keep calling them the MPLA because at a certain point, they did transition to the government of Angola, but
Yeah, they end up becoming the people in charge of Angola, the central government. Yeah.
so I think Angola just gets a lot worse, and it gets close to a failed state.
Hmm. Yeah, I would tend to agree. And I think an interesting historical parallel to keep in mind, which I mentioned in the pre-podcast, is the modern Congo, well, the DROC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Uh, One could make the argument that it itself is almost a failed state. And a big reason for that is because a lot of its neighbors likes to meddle around in its internal affairs and heavily fund and prop up various these are more explicitly secessionist groups,
Mhm.
for the most part, as opposed to just trying to take over the whole government of the entire nation, like what there's going on with the factions in Angola. But I do think the point kind of still stands that countries, neighbors like Uganda, Rwanda, I think Burundi a little bit as well, they even up until this day, there's still significant insurgency in the
Wait,
eastern jungles of the
let,
Congo.
let's pause for a second. By the way, kind of talk about our timeline. Mobutu was overthrown 96, 97. For those of you following along at home, that means that Rwanda went from genocide, civil war to let's export trouble to our neighbor in the course of 3 years.
Something like that. Yeah.
Like a crazy short period of time.
Yeah.
So like, how much trouble could Katanga create?
Exactly. Yeah, that is something, a big thing to keep in mind. And so, but what I think is interesting about this alternate timeline is essentially almost like a geographic reversal of a lot of what is going on in our current timeline, which is we now have more of the Western part, with Angola being what is now kind of the modern situation in Eastern DROC.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With different actors, but kind of similar rationale there, similar reasons. So I think that's all very interesting and fascinating. And so kind of getting back, because, hey, Angola is still, I think, one of the major focuses of this episode. So we have, and kind of getting back to what we were both setting up with what Lumumba's doing, I do want to touch upon what you were starting to develop, which is this possible idea of the Angolan Civil War, itself being possibly, I guess the best way of putting it is our timeline's Angolan Civil War being like largely muted or mitigated or possibly not even happening, but instead either it erupts later down in the alternate timeline or it looks completely different. That I think is a very fascinating possibility. And we can kind of tie the bow on that, because I think what I'm also interested in tracing is how this affects other movements, other decolonization efforts in the region, and what ultimately ends up happening to Lumumba. Because, again, harkening back to our first episode, Lumumba is assassinated in early 61 in our timeline. He was only 35 and when he was executed. We think he has a pretty decent chance of lasting a fairly decently long time, both as the leader of his slice of the Congo, but also just in terms of his probabilistic natural lifespan, assuming he's able to stay in power for a pretty decently long time. So Chris, ultimately, how would we describe what I think we did largely describe what happens in Angola, but how do we, what's kind of the takeaway from that? The I'm not going to say resolution, but just, how the alternate timeline looks of Angola, and then what we kind of see happening with Lumumba in the long term.
So I think it gets real interesting because, first and foremost, the Soviet Cuban MPLA isn't going to be able to just win in Angola the way they did in our timeline. I think it solidifies it's still an active conflict for a longer period of time. What I think things get real interesting in is the 1980s, the 80s into the early 90s. We've hinted at Rwanda. We've hinted at the fall of Mobutu in 97. We should explicitly talk. I believe 94 was the end of apartheid in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of that gets back to one thing, which is the end of the Soviet Union. We are going to get back to Europe. We have to get back to Europe.
Of course, we always got to go back.
But I think the interesting thing is, Lumumba, born in 1927, I want to say.
Something like that, yeah.
He's getting to kind of the natural point where he's in his 60s, in the late 80s. Again, in our timeline, his life is helped along to the end. If it's not even around there, he's going to be kind of slowing down, stepping aside at exactly the time that the Soviet Union is, even if it's still in existence, it's pulling back from some of its adventures because economically it just can't support them. And I think what what leads to a lot of the things that we see in our timeline, especially the fall of Mobutu, and to some extent the United States being okay with the end of an apartheid regime in South Africa, is because the Soviet Union leaves the stage as the bad guys.
Yeah, Soviet Union exits stage right, so there is not as much of a incentive to keep propping up these, Western-backed regimes as much.
You can all, throughout, I mean, throughout the 1980s, when you had, hey, most of us have seen Lethal Weapon 2. Like massive campaigns against South Africa. I mean, economic boycotts, all of it. The Reagan administration was still saying, yeah, one of the components, one of the member groups of the ANC, the African National Congress, is the South African Communist Party.
Is are communists, right?
Explicitly communist. And so throughout the world, you have this devil's bargain where the United States is okay with nasty governments because there are nasty governments. And
as long as said nasty governments are, against the mega bad guys, we're kind of okay looking the other way in certain regards on some of that nastiness.
And to a large extent, I think the removal of the Soviet Union, one, means we're okay with Mobutu being overthrown. Two, means we're not as involved in Central Africa as we might have been vis-a-vis Rwanda. We're okay with the end of apartheid. And so an earlier succession crisis in the Congo just pushes some of that up and makes it a little more interesting, because probably the Soviet, by the time that a natural 86-ish Lumumba's stepping down and whatever's happening after him, probably an engineered succession. But Soviets are already in Afghanistan and they're already pulling back everywhere. So I think that creates a lot of openings for weird things to happen or interesting things to happen.
Definitely. I would 100% agree with that. And I think what's another interesting thought I had as well is, if we have somewhat of this geographic reversal of, rebel groups in Angola and less of an emphasis on more stability, I guess relative stability, one could say, in Eastern Congo and in Katanga, I think this does elevate to a certain degree some possible secessionist movements or separatist movements that we even see in our timeline, but their impact, I would say, is comparatively much more muted compared to the bigger conflicts that are going on in our timelines, Eastern Congo. And
I think one of the really interesting things is what does happen to Katanga, because I think, we've talked a little bit. Rhodesia was such a nasty place. The West was okay with them going out in 1980. Katanga is probably going to survive into the late 80s, maybe later. But at a certain point, you're going to have a question of either is Katanga going to open up? Is it going to democratize? Which I don't think it is. It's going to face a major problem of, kind of, you were saying earlier, Rhodesia was like a 7% to a 93% split.
Yeah.
I mean, Katanga's got to be like 95 or
Katanga. Yeah, I was trying to look up demographic information on the Katanga province, and I didn't really find any. But I just kind of had a safe assumption that it was It was
And
somewhere in the 90s.
and it's going to be an issue as soon as we no longer need their stuff.
Right. Yeah. No, that is definitely a very fascinating impact to trace as well. Um, Getting back to my thread of thought that I was starting to tie there.
No.
There is I had one group in mind that I had looked up in my, research, and also as well I would be interested in another separatist region as well, and I'll mention them both, but I won't get ahead of myself. I'll go for the first one. But even in our timeline, for example, we have a new religious movement and separatist group called Bundu dia Congo, or BDK for short. And they, interestingly enough, are actually focused more on recreating like a medieval era kingdom
Mhm.
of the Congo, and this is Congo with a K. So it's like it's an ethnic group, it's a language. It's a very interesting little separatist group in our timeline. But I think in the alternate timeline, with everything that's going on, because they're not just claiming territory in Congo. They're wanting to unite territory from a few different African states, mainly Angola, mainly Congo, but also little slices of like Gabon, I believe, couple other countries as well. But the case in point is, as opposed to it being a relatively um, you know, minor, I guess you can say,
Mhm.
movement in our timeline. I think in the alternate timeline, it's going to be probably a bigger force, primarily because of power vacuums, primarily taking place in Angolan territory, um, and the West being a lot less stable in the alternate timeline versus what we have in our timeline. But another region that, Chris, I'm in particular very interested in what you have to say about this, um, is the Angolan exclave of Cabinda. And I don't know if I pronounced that name right, but I'm just going to roll with it. Um, Cabinda, from what I recall, it's a very small slice of territory that is separated by the modern DROC from Angola, but they have like a good chunk of oil and natural gas resources themselves, kind of punching a little above their weight in terms of
Offshore, but yeah.
we're offshore again, but punching above their weight a bit in terms of like how small the territory is compared to the rest of Angola. They have had an independence movement or separatist movement themselves for quite some time.
Mhm.
Is there a possibility? I'm just going to proactively say more likely not. Or if it is successful, it'll probably get crushed like Katanga was in our timeline. But do we see an independent Cabinda in uh in the alternate timeline?
I don't I don't think you see an independent Cabinda. I think what you might see is a Congolese Cabinda.
I was gonna say it rolled into that. That's immediately what I was kind of thinking, is it might eventually get rolled into taken over to Congo. So
I mean, what I'm what's going through my mind is, to some extent, um the modern kind of Levant area, in that you have these countries whose borders were drawn without.
with very little regard for local understandings, tribes, languages, whatever.
And what I think might you would see is, in a transitional period in Congo, where the central government, i.e., Lumumba, is losing a step or has stepped down and there's a power vacuum, plus kind of the very weakened Angolan state. I think what you might see is, especially by the way, if you have kind of a Western idea of we're still going to have access to the resources. What I think you
Mm-hmm.
might see is a little bit more openness to redrawing some of these things, rather than being so locked into
Yeah.
the borders as they were drawn 100 years ago in Berlin.
Yeah. No, and I think that has very fascinating downstream impacts for not just this part of Africa, but possibly other parts of Africa as well.
Specifically this, because this is where you have those massive countries that have like 12 different groups jammed together.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. So just kind of taking a mental step back here.
Sure.
We have the Cold War, the broader context of the Cold War still largely playing out as it does in our timeline. We have, some different shifting players and movements and a couple new countries or two probably in the alternate timeline. Southern Africa, this region probably being a bit more important in the context of the Cold War. Like it's not going to become the next Vietnam or Afghanistan for the US or the Soviets in my view. But
it's interesting to think about the Clark Amendment in 1975-76. Basically, like the United States, our timelines in Angolan Civil War kicked off, I believe, basically about the time that Saigon fell.
Yeah, I think you're roughly right in that neighborhood. Yeah.
And so the basically like the United States Congress passed multiple laws, rules, everything, which said, yeah, you are not getting involved in this. Under no circumstances can we get involved in it.
Yeah.
We still send supplies, but like it was very much having anything to do with it. There is some interesting arguments to be made that this could have become an earlier Afghanistan, an earlier kind of Soviet quagmire, because they would have sent that support in and would have been dealing with Katangan involvement. I feel like the Soviet Union, though, would have been very happy with the friendly Congo and might well have just been okay not overcommitting there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I can definitely see it being like maybe like a smaller quagmire for sure, but still a quagmire nonetheless. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so we see, I guess I'm just really personally fascinated by like tracing the possibility of, I guess more malleable like national borders. Because I think that would have really big impacts and changes on a lot of the trends that we see, even up until the modern day, in a lot of African countries. And but yeah, what are some of your other, I guess, main thoughts or things that we might be missing here, Chris?
I mean, I think what's gonna be interesting is what happens to the Katangan state
Yeah.
in the 90s, because what's coming is China. China isn't there yet, but what's coming is a foreign country. There is kind of, and it kind of lines up pretty good with the Clinton era of, okay, we don't need to support like Manuel Noriega anymore.
Yeah.
Don't need friends like that. We also, so this idea, Carter kind of started of this idea of, well, human rights is our foreign policy. And yes, I realize that this happened like during Bosnia, during Rwanda. But hey, those were foreign policy issues, which on a certain level, they may not have been earlier if more of the Kissingerian realpolitik was in play.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting to think about, like, does Katang, and basically what winds up happening in the 2000s is China has now become large enough that it can actually be like a player, and it
A
can
player in the
actually,
region. Yeah.
it can actually support its friends versus like working with the United States to support
Yeah.
anything.
Well, and I mean, a thought that just kind of came into my mind as well is, I mean, if we're talking about like the Clinton presidency, for example, Bosnia, which, by the way, just as a side note, I can't get over the fact that if I remember right, Bosnia essentially happened because Hillary Clinton would not sleep with Bill Clinton until it was actually fixed, until he actually committed troops to make that happen. Now, I might be misremembering it, but or I might be misremembering the region, but I'm pretty sure.
You mean the American intervention to stop the Serb genocide?
Yes,
All
exactly.
of it happened before Hillary Clinton. We are not going to say she had anything to do with the downfall of Yugoslavia. We are not even suggesting that. We need to make that perfectly clear right now.
Yeah, no, definitely. But
Okay.
point is, so what I'm kind of starting to lead to here, though, is, Bosnia has been largely seen as a, pretty successful American intervention. And, even in like modern, like Kosovo, for example, there's a ton of American support. Like that region of Serbia, whether you want to call it an independent country or a part of Serbia, they still love the Americans for that reason. Now, of course, Serbia itself, I mean, I'm not getting into the whole Balkans and, all the complexities there, but case in point, Bosnia, largely seen for the most part as being decently successful. Rwanda, we
I
know
will go
nothing.
ahead and question that because it did take so long to do something.
Right. That is a valid point. But I think it took us a while to do something versus in Rwanda, where we, for all intents and purposes, basically did nothing. And the United Nations also was basically unable to do anything. And that, I would say, has been widely seen and widely regarded as a foreign policy failure on the part of the Clinton administration. And so if we see, for example, because like we were okay with allowing the apartheid government to fall, let's say we have the same policy, we're okay with, Rhodesia and Katanga eventually falling as well. Does this really change anything? And I did kind of note, Chris, that we kind of did seem to somewhat assume in some of what we were building that like the Rwandan genocide still happens, based on a little bit of what you said. But like, I guess I'm just questioning based on timelines and based on, possible different dynamics here in the region, if we would have seen any change in American policy here or not, a sooner intervention or any intervention at all, let alone like sooner intervention, or do we think, Rwanda would have played out similarly as it did in our timeline?
I think that's a really interesting question. One of the, I think what I think it might be a little more noticed. And the reason I'm saying that is like in our timeline, Central Africa kind of wasn't really looked at geopolitically.
Yeah.
After kind of 64, 66, once Mobutu kind of solidified it. In the American conception, somehow you have Idi Amin somewhere in here, but people aren't quite familiar with like what country he was and what happened there. But I think I think also interestingly enough, Bosnia might have a similar problem in that it was always Yugoslavia. So you had people generally just assume, no, that's Yugoslavia. And I think if you have,
I mean, Yugoslavia, for all intents and purposes, is basically the European version of what if we decided to include a whole bunch of disparate peoples and religions and throw them all into one giant country and make it taste good. That was the Balkans version of what happened in Africa.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a European chef salad. It's the stuff you're not using anywhere else. Just toss it into there.
Yeah.
But I think there's that sense of like, oh, it's just that, without getting into all of that intricacy.
Hmm.
So I think if you do have the Katangan issues being brought up in the 1980s,
Hmm.
if you have the United States paying attention to Lumumba's Congo, I think one of the things is, hey, we kind of don't want to talk about Zaire. We don't want to think about what Mobutu's doing because we 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 know that we don't want to know.
Pretty much. Yeah. We
Um,
got other fish to fry on
he's.
top of that too.
I mean, I want to say it was Kennedy who said Mobutu is RSOB. Um,
I think so.
but
Yeah.
like this idea of, again, he's ours, so we don't need to look at anything else that's going on there. So I think if you have Central Africa mattering more in the
Yeah.
geopolitics, being more of in play, then maybe I think you do have. I'm reminded of a story that in 1975, when Angola is becoming a thing, in a briefing for the National Security Council, basically Kissinger said that Angola is a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. This idea that it just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
If we have a very rich Western aligned country, if we have a Soviet client state on the other side of it, and then Angola playing off, people are going to notice. It's going to be on more newspapers. And maybe if we're very, very lucky, I think we might even be able to get the percentage of Americans that can point out where the Congo is up into like the 17%.
At the very least. Yeah. I figured you were going to be able to bring that up at some other point during the rest of the show, and I was not disappointed. So, hey, alternate timeline. Clearly, the biggest impact of this fork is greater geographical awareness among the American populace. There you go.
The American policymakers.
Yes, exactly.
I'm getting to another like serious, a good movie about the Vietnam War, path to war, and you have Johnson complaining that we don't have anybody that knows anything about like Vietnam. We don't have Vietnam people, and I think that's part of that is when you have people who are entering like college and studying foreign affairs, is this something that you can make a career out of? Is this something where there's stuff going on, so let me study it and learn about it?
Yeah. And that's actually kind of interesting as we, start wrapping up this show. That is actually kind of a small change, but also one that could have potentially big ripple effects for certain, diplomats, people, change the circumstances, change individual people's
Or again, just like
career
this area
orientations.
mattering and
And
us
this
being
area, in
interested in
fact,
it.
actually being more important itself. Yeah, that is quite a fascinating, interesting world to think about. But anyway, I think that's pretty much just about all that I have on this topic. I will note that the vexillologist, for those who don't know or don't tune into Evan Extemporaneous, the sister podcast, that's the study of flags. For the vexillologist in me, I do have to say, one thing I don't think changes very much in this alternate timeline is Angola's flag, because as we know, all the sides in Angola were basically certain flavors of the communist fruitcake. And Angola's flag, it has basically it is reminiscent of the hammer and sickle, but it is not in fact a hammer and sickle. It is in fact, it's one of the most interesting, stark, impressive flag designs, I would say. It has half of a cogwheel and a machete, which, between that and Mozambique's invoking of the AK-47, like, I think it's very stark, interesting imagery, and I don't think that we're going to probably see a major change on that level, regardless, in this alternate timeline. But that's just like the one little nerdy vexillological thing I wanted to mention at the end of this episode.
I do think actually it might be a little bit of a boon to vexillologists once we get into the period where we did talk about shifting borders.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
And hey, look up the Katangan flag, like in our timeline. I think it looks actually pretty visually cool. It's pretty visually appealing. And I think it actually incorporates like a little bit of a design element from the Kingdom of the Congo in its own flag, which I think it's a kind of an interesting historical callback. But anyway, that's about all I had to share. Chris, do you have any other last minute thoughts before we wrap this up?
Not particularly.
Nope. All right. Well, hey, it took us a little bit to get back to making the second part, but we, in fact, did keep to our word and made our grand return. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And as always, we have our thriving little Discord community. We love hearing from you guys. Give us your feedback. What did you think about this show? Where we might have gotten it right or wrong, or just some alternate things that we might not have fully thought through. We would love to hear from you. And as we always like to end this show, if we happen to come across a fork in time, what do you think we should do with it?
Grab as many mercenaries as you can, hop in a Jeep, and make for Luanda.
100%. I don't have a way to beat that, and I'm gonna go with that for this episode. Usually, the way the quote goes is, if we see a fork in time, I think you should take it. Have a good one, everyone, and thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.